Texas summer heat pressed down on the barbed wire compound that day in mid-June 1945, and inside those fences, men who had crossed an ocean as prisoners of war stood watching something they couldn't quite process. The scent of smoking meat drifted through the air, thick and sweet with hickory, while American servicemen worked over massive cuts of beef that looked too generous to be real. Youngsters darted past clutching frozen desserts, glass bottles of that famous cola sweating in the sunshine, and every moment of it contradicted what these prisoners had been taught to believe about their captors. They had arrived expecting brutality, sparse meals, perhaps cruelty as payment for the war they had waged. What they found instead would prove far more unsettling to men raised on the Reich's vision of a weak, starving America. The whole phenomenon began not with women prisoners, though certain European newspapers had screamed that headline in their pages during those months. The sensational claim spread that German women were being held in American camps, a story designed to provoke outrage and curiosity in equal measure. But anyone who examined the ledgers and official records would discover the truth looked quite different. The United States had transported across the Atlantic nearly 500,000 German prisoners between the early 40s and the end of the war, and the overwhelming majority were men, veterans from Rommel's desert campaigns, soldiers captured when the Afrika Korps finally collapsed in North Africa, fighting men pulled from Wehrmacht divisions that surrendered by the tens of thousands. The myth about women prisoners gained traction anyway, because myths always carry more power than careful facts, and this particular falsehood opened a door into something stranger than fiction could invent. What actually happened on American soil defied the expectations that war usually creates. More than 425,000 German captives found themselves distributed across compounds that stretched from the rocky coast of Maine down to the sun-scorched plains of Texas. Guards watched them, certainly, but the treatment they received stayed within the boundaries established by international convention and often exceeded those minimum requirements. The prisoners received clothing, housing, and food portions that many would later describe as better than what they had eaten while serving their own military. They were absorbed into the daily rhythms of American life in ways that seemed almost impossible to men who had been warned their enemies were corrupt, impoverished, and cruel. The gap between what they expected and what they experienced became the real story, more shocking than any invented scandal about women behind wire. Consider the absurdity of their position. The regime they had served built its entire mythology around the idea that democracies were weak, that America in particular was a nation choking on its own decadence, unable to feed its people despite loud propaganda about prosperity. Soldiers carried into battle the certainty that their opponents were paper tigers, nations hollowed out by economic failure and moral decay. One journal confiscated from a soldier in Tunisia contained warnings about American society, claims that citizens starved while their government lied about abundance, predictions that any captured German would face worse conditions than existed back home. Within just a few weeks of surrender, though, those same soldiers would be staring at portions of meat so enormous they seemed designed for shock value rather than sustenance. This account isn't really about diet and camp kitchens, though those details matter tremendously. It's about a battle fought not with weapons, but with the simple fact of plenty, a confrontation between ideology and reality that played out 3 times daily in mess halls across America. Every meal became evidence against the propaganda these men had absorbed. Every full belly a small defeat for the worldview they had carried into war. One prisoner remembered years later how disturbing it was to watch Americans casually discard food that would have been treasured in Germany. Bread crusts tossed away, potato peels thrown to animals, bacon grease considered waste rather than a valuable cooking resource. That casual disposal of what should have been precious marked the beginning of doubt, the first small crack in a wall of certainty that had seemed unbreakable. Understanding how a simple outdoor meal in Texas could function as a tool of ideological warfare requires following these prisoners backward through time to the moment of their capture, the journey that brought them across an ocean, and the slow accumulation of evidence that everything they had been told was wrong. Their story began in the desert, where sand and shortage had ground down an army until surrender became inevitable. May of 1943 brought the end of Axis ambitions in North Africa. Dust settled over Tunisia as exhausted columns of German and Italian soldiers trudged into captivity, their legendary commander having already departed, leaving behind forces that had run out of fuel, ammunition, and hope. The Allied advance had been overwhelming, supply lines strangled, and within a matter of weeks nearly 275,000 men laid down their weapons. It ranked as one of the largest mass surrenders the war had yet produced. Many of these captives anticipated execution, or at minimum, the kind of brutal treatment that defeated armies had historically suffered. Instead, they found themselves loaded into vehicles, given water, and informed they were bound for a destination most had never seriously considered as a possibility, America itself. The logistics began in North African ports, Algiers and Oran, where harbors swelled with the workhorses of American maritime power. These Liberty ships had been designed as cargo vessels, built to haul tanks and grain and fuel across submarine-infested waters, churned out by shipyards at a pace that seemed impossible to European observers. Now those same vessels served a new purpose, ferrying human cargo by the tens of thousands each month. Between the summer of 1943 and the war's conclusion, upwards of 30,000 German prisoners made the Atlantic crossing every 30 days, packed into holds originally meant for freight. Bunks were wedged into cargo spaces, barbed wire was strung across open decks, and armed guards paced narrow walkways between rows of men who'd become valuable prisoners rather than dangerous enemies. The smell of those crossings stayed with survivors forever. Salt spray working its way through steel hatches, mixing with the sweat of crowded bodies, damp wool uniforms, and the sour bite of seasickness that afflicted men unused to weeks at sea. Prisoners whispered to each other in those cramped conditions, trying to make sense of their destination. One man scratched in his diary about being shipped to the land his leaders had described as bloated with false prosperity, though his words carried a weight of skepticism that suggested he no longer quite believed the old lessons. Doubt gnawed at them even before arrival, because even in the depths of cargo holds, food arrived on trays that contradicted everything they had been taught about American scarcity. Bread that was soft and pale, actual meat rather than substitutes, butter appearing as if it were common rather than a luxury reserved for special occasions. A soldier later testified that shipboard meals surpassed what he had eaten at the front, and he couldn't reconcile that fact with the narrative of a starving enemy nation. Above deck, Liberty ships moved in convoy formation, protected by destroyer escorts whose crews scanned the horizon for the periscopes of U-boats still prowling these waters. Prisoners listened to the throb of engines, the splash of depth charges being rolled into the sea, and the tense silence that followed when no explosion confirmed a hit. Every sound reminded them their survival now depended on the navy of the nation they had been fighting. A bitter irony not lost on men who had spent years trying to destroy these same vessels. German soldiers fed by American cooks, protected by American sailors, carried toward captivity inside the very industrial machine their leaders had dismissed as incapable of sustained production. The voyage itself became an education in scale. Prisoners counted ships stretching across the horizon, sometimes more than 100 vessels moving in coordinated lines. They watched cranes at port, swinging cargo with mechanical precision, unloading supplies in Algiers only to reload different materials bound for Europe. Numbers circulated through the holds in whispered conversations. Intelligence suggested the Americans were launching one new Liberty ship every 3 days, an impossible rate of construction that seemed designed to break the spirit of anyone calculating what that meant for the war's outcome. To men from a nation where industrial capacity was being bombed into rubble night after night, it felt like standing inside a factory that would never stop running, a machine that couldn't be defeated because it simply produced faster than any attack could destroy. Yet even in those dim, swaying cargo holds, another kind of recognition was beginning. The guards weren't monsters. They shared cigarettes during calm moments, spoke casually about baseball games and harvests back home, mentioned wives and farms and mills in places like Kansas and Oregon. For many prisoners, these were the first conversations that suggested their enemies might be ordinary human beings, rather than the demons of propaganda films. One man remembered most clearly the sound of mess trays clanging as food was distributed. That sound, he said later, meant survival. It meant being fed. It meant staying alive. But the true revelation still waited ahead, on docks where the industrial might of America would be visible in ways no amount of propaganda could have prepared them for. Norfolk Harbor in Virginia presented itself to German eyes in June of 1943 as a vision of order and plenty that contradicted months of expectation. Cranes rose like steel forests. Warehouses stretched in orderly rows, stacked with goods. Train tracks hummed with the passage of locomotives, pulling cars without end. And nowhere could be seen the rubble, the broken glass, the bombed-out structures that these men had left behind in their own cities. To arrive from a world of destruction into this functioning industrial landscape felt like stepping between realities, and the dissonance was profound. Disembarkation proceeded with efficient calm rather than chaos or cruelty. Prisoners filed down gangplanks under supervision, boots ringing on steel, and what struck them immediately wasn't hostility, but systematic organization. Trucks waited in formation. Red Cross personnel stood ready with clipboards. American soldiers carried paperwork rather than displayed weapons. One captive described it as feeling more like entering a factory than a prison, everything moving with smooth precision, everything suggesting resources without apparent limit. Processing began with medical examination, a procedure the prisoners initially suspected might be designed for humiliation. Doctors in clean uniforms, stethoscopes hanging from their necks, checked vitals and recorded conditions. Most of the arriving Germans, hardened though they were by desert combat, carried the physical marks of inadequate nutrition. Records from Norfolk show the average prisoner arrived weighing 25 to 30 pounds, below healthy standards for his height and age. Nearly 20% displayed clear symptoms of vitamin deficiency. Night blindness from lack of vitamin A, bleeding gums indicating scurvy, skin rashes from pellagra, weakness from beriberi. The medical evidence revealed what propaganda had worked hard to conceal, that the supposedly elite warriors of Europe were undernourished and fragile. Then came food, and with it the beginning of genuine shock. Hot meals rather than scraps, milk poured freely rather than rationed by the ounce. Bread that was soft and white instead of coarse and dark. Meat appearing in quantities so generous the prisoners initially suspected theatrical deception. One man recalled everyone waiting for cameras to appear, for the announcement that this abundance was staged for propaganda purposes. But no cameras came. The food was simply food, distributed without fanfare, as if this were normal rather than extraordinary. Processing camps served standard army fare to the arriving prisoners. Scrambled eggs and fried potatoes, beef stew thick with vegetables and coffee, endless coffee. The aroma of actual roasted beans rather than the grain substitutes they had known was intoxicating to men who hadn't smelled real coffee in years. Diaries recorded their confusion. "Surely their own soldiers don't eat like this," wrote a corporal from Bremen, but the evidence suggested American soldiers did eat exactly like this, and so did their prisoners. The psychological impact of these meals cannot be measured in calories alone. German propaganda had constructed an image of America as hollow at its core, unable to clothe or feed its population despite loud claims of prosperity. Yet here the enemy not only fed its own forces well, but extended nearly the same provisions to captured opponents. Medical reports noted average weight gains of 10 to 12 pounds within the first few weeks of captivity. Observers recorded strange behaviors among the prisoners, laughter during meals followed by sudden silence, as if the men feared this plenty would be snatched away at any moment. Processing centers also provided first glimpses of American material abundance in its casual, everyday form. Prisoners saw warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with crates of fruit, tobacco, even chocolate, none of it under armed guard because theft seemed not to be an expected problem. They watched trains roll past outside the fences, each car filled with grain or coal or machinery, convoy after convoy suggesting resources so deep they might be infinite. The sheer scale unsettled them in ways combat never had. One sergeant remembered wondering how any nation could possess so much while simultaneously fighting a global war. Smells remained in memory long after other details faded. Diesel exhaust from the locomotives, pine tar from the docks, and above all the omnipresent aroma of cooking food, a scent so constant and rich it seemed to define the atmosphere of America itself. To step off a ship half-starved and immediately breathe in roasting meat and baking bread was to experience a sensory assault that demolished worldviews more effectively than any lecture or film could have done. But Norfolk represented only the beginning of their education. Ahead lay rail journeys through landscapes untouched by war, through farmland and forests, past towns where shop windows displayed goods without apparent shortage. If Norfolk cracked the surface of Nazi mythology, the journey inland would shatter it completely. Prisoners found themselves herded onto passenger cars, windows barred but still open to the moving air, and the clatter of wheels on rails began the next phase of their captivity. For many men, this train ride through the American interior proved more astounding than even the food had been. The locomotive pulled westward through the Shenandoah Valley, and out the windows rolled a landscape that seemed lifted from some idealized painting rather than from the reality of a world at war. Orchards heavy with ripening apples stretched across hillsides. Fields carpeted in alfalfa glowed green. Barns stood freshly painted in red and white, as if maintaining appearances mattered more than mere survival. The prisoners pressed against the glass, murmuring to each other. "Not a bomb crater anywhere," one remembered saying, "not a single ruin." For soldiers who had departed cities reduced to smoking rubble, the sight of intact American towns proved almost more disturbing than their captivity. Roofs complete rather than blown apart, windows with glass rather than boards, children playing in streets that showed no signs of fear or hunger. The sounds of the journey embedded themselves in memory. The locomotive's whistle echoing across valleys, the rhythmic clatter of tracks beneath their feet, and between these mechanical noises, the surprising sound of American families waving as the train passed. Sometimes children ran alongside the tracks, throwing packages of chewing gum or chocolate bars through the bars. Small gifts from young civilians to enemy soldiers that made no sense under the logic of war. A corporal from Cologne wrote in his journal about receiving 2 chocolate bars from a child, feeling shame that the enemy's youngest generation had luxuries to spare when his own siblings were going hungry. As the train pushed deeper into southern territory, the scale of American agriculture became undeniable. Mile after mile of farmland, corn growing as far as sight could reach, cattle grazing behind well-maintained fences, irrigation systems glittering under sunlight. For men accustomed to rationing and shortage, this abundance represented a kind of wealth that transcended money. The United States wasn't merely feeding its massive military forces overseas, wasn't just supplying its civilian population at home, but apparently had excess production that could be wasted without concern. One prisoner muttered to his companion that if America could produce on this scale, victory for Germany had never been possible. Late summer of 1943 saw many trains converging on Texas, where construction crews had raced to build entire compounds in months rather than years. Camp Swift near Bastrop stood as one of the largest, completed in barely 4 months despite its enormous scope. The facility sprawled across thousands of acres, featuring rows of wooden barracks, guard towers at intervals, kitchens capable of feeding thousands, workshops, and even a hospital equipped with modern medical supplies. By autumn, the camp held approximately 5,000 German prisoners, a city of captives living in conditions that many would later describe as superior to their former barracks in Germany. Camp Swift embodied contradictions the prisoners struggled to process. A prison, yes, with barbed wire and armed guards, yet more comfortable than many of the facilities they had known as free soldiers serving their own nation. Electric lights glowed after dark, rather than forcing men to sit in blackout conditions. Hot water flowed from taps rather than requiring hauling and heating. Latrines flushed with the simple pull of a handle rather than demanding primitive sanitation. Each barrack contained stoves for winter warmth, fans for summer heat, and mess halls that served 3 substantial meals every single day. Unteroffizier Hans Müller described it as feeling like entering a modern world he had been told didn't exist outside German engineering. The sensory impressions of Texas burned themselves into prisoner consciousness. Air carried the scent of mesquite and dust. Cicadas droned in relentless heat, and evenings glowed with smoke from cooking fires drifting across prairie grass. Initially, the captives expected harsh discipline, perhaps brutality, as payment for being on the losing side. Instead, guards spoke to them in conversational tones, sometimes even joking, and issued them uniforms, bedding, soap, and information about work assignments to come. The contradiction tightened its grip on German minds. Here they were prisoners in fact and in name, yet treated with more dignity and given better material conditions than they had experienced as free men under their own government. They were captives behind wire, yet they slept on actual mattresses and ate meals that left them satisfied rather than hungry. A diary entry recorded the confusion plainly. "We are imprisoned, but in our stomachs, America feels like freedom compared to what our families have." Then came the invitation to witness something entirely outside their experience, an American summer tradition that would crystallize all the contradictions they had been absorbing since their arrival. The 4th of July barbecue at Camp Swift in 1944 would prove to be more than just a meal. It would be a demonstration of cultural power that no propaganda could have countered. July 4th arrived in Texas with cloudless skies and heat that shimmered off the ground. Cicadas rattled in mesquite trees, and smoke began rising above the wire well before noon. For the German prisoners, the date held no significance beyond being another day of captivity. For Texans, it meant Independence Day, and celebration in Texas meant gathering music and, above all, food. By late afternoon, the contradiction reached its peak when prisoners were marched out under guard to witness a feast that violated every lesson the Reich had taught them about their enemies. Cooking pits lined an open area, each dug shallow into earth and filled with glowing coals of hickory and mesquite. The smoke rose sweet and sharp, carrying layers of scent that pulled at empty stomachs. On metal grates above the coals, massive slabs of beef brisket hissed and dripped fat that sizzled when it hit the embers. Some of these cuts weighed 12 to 15 pounds, larger than anything these men had seen, even in peacetime Germany. The air thickened with the smell of spices, black pepper and paprika, and garlic mixing with the dark sweetness of brown sugar in the rub. A local rancher, broad-shouldered and weathered by decades of Texas sun, lifted the lid from one of the steel smokers and pierced the meat with a long fork. The bark had formed crisp and dark, and just beneath the surface a pink smoke ring glowed through the char. He laughed as he displayed it to the watching prisoners, his voice carrying across the space as he explained it had been cooking for 12 hours, slow and patient. The Germans stared in disbelief. Several men shook their heads, one whispering that no one cooks meat for prisoners like this, it must be for show. But the meat was real, and it kept coming. Alongside the brisket came side dishes that seemed designed to overwhelm through their sheer variety and abundance. Cornbread crumbling golden yellow from cast-iron skillets. Beans that had simmered for hours with molasses until they were rich and sweet. Potatoes baked until their skins split open and steam rose from fluffy white interiors. Glass jars of pickles stood on tables next to bowls of coleslaw crisp with vinegar. Children darted between the serving areas carrying glass bottles of that famous cola, the drink that cost a nickel at any store but was being handed out freely today. Prisoners watched American families pile their plates high, laughing and singing, and some of those families even offered food across the invisible barrier that separated captor from captive. A teenage girl approached the wire fence and pushed a slice of peach cobbler through to a stunned sergeant who accepted it numbly. He wrote in his diary that night about thinking of his sister standing in queues for bread in Hanover, while here they give dessert to the enemy as if it means nothing. Music added another layer to the surreal experience. Fiddles and guitars, a harmonica wailing out melodies, country tunes rolling across the prairie, mixed with the sharp pop of firecrackers and the general hum of celebration. Some prisoners found themselves clapping along despite their uncertainty, embarrassed to show enjoyment, yet unable to resist the infectious rhythms. Others turned away, unwilling to display emotion in front of their fellows, but all of them felt the same fundamental weight, the impossible contradiction of being fed like honored guests while confined as defeated enemies. Numbers reinforced what their senses were telling them. In Germany, civilian ration books by this point in the war limited families to perhaps 2 pounds of meat per week, and often the actual allotment fell short of even that meager promise. Here, in a single evening, men were being offered more meat than their families might see in an entire month. Briskets of 15 pounds each, dozens of them roasting at once, hundreds of pounds of beef consumed in celebration. Dr. Wilhelm Huffman, who served as one of the camp physicians, murmured to a fellow prisoner that this wasn't propaganda or deception. This was simply daily life in America, and it destroyed everything they had been taught. The taste lingered in their mouths and their memories, smoky and rich, tender meat slicing easily, juices soaking into soft bread. A corporal from Stuttgart wrote in his diary that night about being unable to sleep, not from hunger, but from having eaten so much he felt sick. More than that, though, he felt confused. Why feed us so generously, he wrote, when we killed their sons, when we tried to destroy them? Why do they give us meat and celebration? That night, as fireworks cracked and bloomed above Bastrop, prisoners lay in their bunks with the smell of barbecue smoke still clinging to their clothes. For many, it marked the first moment of undeniable proof that America wasn't the impoverished nation their leaders had described. The enemy had revealed its true weapon, not brutality or vengeance, but generosity so casual it seemed almost thoughtless. Yet this single feast, spectacular as it was, represented only a glimpse. The deeper shock would come from the steady, everyday rhythm of camp life, from canteens and paychecks and small luxuries that accumulated into an undeniable truth. The barbecue provided drama, but what truly astonished the prisoners was the relentless normality of abundance. Day after day, week after week, the patterns repeated until they became simply the way things were, and that consistency proved more powerful than any single spectacular event. What they saw written into daily menus, stamped onto pay vouchers, purchased with their own earned credits, demonstrated that American plenty wasn't a performance staged for their benefit, but the actual ordinary pulse of the nation. Breakfast began the pattern fresh each morning. Prisoners woke to the clang of mess hall bells and found trays waiting with eggs, prepared multiple ways, scrambled or fried or boiled, depending on what the cooks felt like making. Oatmeal arrived sweetened with actual sugar rather than substitutes. Toast came spread with butter, not margarine, accompanied by thick slices of bacon that crackled with fat. Coffee flowed from urns, dark and hot and real, not the bitter roasted grain mixture that had become standard in Germany. To drink genuine coffee every morning, a prisoner from Munich wrote, was a luxury our generals didn't have at home, yet here we have it as prisoners. Lunch and dinner reinforced the same lessons. Beef stews, thick with potatoes and carrots, fried chicken with seasoned crispy coating, loaves of white bread baked fresh on site every day, pies filled with whatever fruit was in season, apples or cherries or pumpkin. Peanut butter appeared in the mess halls, a strange, sticky, sweet substance that fascinated the Germans. One diary entry noted finding it disgusting at first, then becoming unable to stop eating it. Even potato chips, thin, crispy slices of fried potato, salted and crunchy, appeared in the canteens, a snack food that seemed both frivolous and emblematic of a nation that could afford to fry potatoes for entertainment rather than necessity. Then there was the matter of wages. Geneva Convention rules entitled prisoners to compensation for their labor, and in American camps, this translated into tokens or scrip that could be exchanged at the camp canteen. With these earnings, men could purchase cigarettes, candy bars, shaving supplies, writing paper, and most remarkably, bottles of Coca-Cola, served cold with ice. A sergeant from Bavaria wrote about sitting in shade on a hot afternoon, drinking an ice-cold cola and listening to a radio broadcast, thinking to himself that this couldn't possibly be what captivity was supposed to feel like. The numbers involved shocked them as deeply as the luxuries themselves. United States Army regulations allotted POWs nearly identical rations to American soldiers, approximately 3,500 calories per day. This compared to German civilian rations that had dropped to 1,500 calories or less by late 1944, sometimes falling even lower in cities under heavy bombardment. Where German families stood in queues for hours, hoping to purchase a few ounces of butter, prisoners in America spread it thick on bread without a second thought. The disparity created guilt, disbelief, envy, and gratitude, all mixed together in proportions that varied by individual temperament. Entertainment entered the picture as well, another aspect of camp life that defied expectations. Camps maintained libraries stocked with books in both English and German, classics of literature alongside American novels. Film screenings happened regularly. Hollywood productions selected carefully to avoid giving offense, but still providing actual entertainment. Music filled the air. Swing records played on phonographs, church choirs practicing hymns, sometimes even visiting bands performing for the prisoners. The captives themselves could form orchestras, stage theatrical productions, or paint murals on barrack walls if they had artistic inclinations. For many, the luxury that cut deepest was simple freedom of movement within the compounds. Yes, barbed wire marked the boundaries. Yes, armed guards patrolled the perimeter. But inside those boundaries, men could walk across open ground, tend garden plots, play soccer matches, while fellow prisoners cheered from the sides. In some locations, they were taken outside the wire entirely, hired out to nearby farms or sawmills, riding in trucks past astonished local civilians who saw enemy soldiers waving like ordinary workers heading to their shifts. A guard stationed at one Texas camp remembered a farmer saying those Krauts worked harder than the local boys he was paying wages. The contrast to what propaganda had promised was stark and undeniable. Germany's information apparatus had constructed an image of America collapsing under its own contradictions, a nation of breadlines and shortages barely holding itself together. But the canteens, full of goods, the pay slips that allowed purchasing power, the Coca-Colas and butter and steady, reliable meat, all told a different truth. The daily shock wasn't in grand gestures, but in the casual, thoughtless abundance that characterized ordinary American life. One prisoner attempted to summarize it in a letter home, though censors read every word before anything was mailed. "If this is how they live normally," he wrote, "then we have been lied to more profoundly than we ever knew." And yet even more startling encounters waited ahead, not within camp boundaries, but outside them, when prisoners began walking American streets as laborers, seeing with their own eyes the prosperity of towns untouched by war. By middle of 1944, something extraordinary began happening with regularity. German prisoners who had steeled themselves for punishment and deprivation found themselves boarding trucks not to toil in hidden labor camps, but to ride into actual American towns. The destinations were farms needing harvest hands, factories short on workers, sawmills requiring lumber crews, sometimes even civic improvement projects. The paradox was plain and painful. Men who had marched into war as conquerors now served as laborers in the heartland of the country they had tried to destroy. The sights that greeted them produced astonishment that wouldn't fade with time. Instead of ruined cities or desperate poverty, America revealed orderly rows of houses with fresh paint and neat porches, markets overflowing with goods, children pedaling bicycles with baskets full of produce. A prisoner from Hamburg recalled walking past a butcher shop window in Kansas and staring at more meat displayed there than he had seen in all of Hamburg over the course of a month. "I thought it had to be a dream or a trick," he said later, "but it wasn't. Numbers tell part of the story." By 1945, more than 200,000 POWs were actively employed as laborers throughout the United States, contributing an estimated 45 million man-days of work to the American economy. They picked cotton across Texas, harvested wheat throughout Nebraska, felled timber in Arkansas forests, and constructed roads across the Midwest. Payment came in the form of canteen coupons rather than American currency. Yet even these tokens represented wealth compared to what their families were experiencing back home. The paradox of perception deepened with each outing. These were enemy soldiers, armed combatants who had killed American troops, yet they encountered civility and sometimes outright kindness. Farmers invited them to rest under shade trees and offered lemonade. Church groups arrived with sandwiches. In occasional cases, prisoners were even welcomed into homes for proper cooked meals. A Minnesota woman recalled decades later that the prisoners looked so young and tired that her mother couldn't help giving them bread with jam, and they thanked her as if it were gold. But the shock carried another dimension beyond kindness. The prisoners had expected hostility, perhaps stones thrown or curses shouted. What they found instead were Americans who weren't starving, weren't beaten down by war, but thriving in ways they had been assured were impossible. Truck rides took them past fields of corn that stretched beyond the horizon, grain elevators rising like towers over small towns, freight trains so long that counting the cars became pointless after the first 100. The sheer scale of American agriculture and industry overwhelmed men who had been taught their enemy was on the verge of collapse. Irony cut deep because letters from home painted an entirely different picture. German rations had dropped below 1,200 calories per day for civilians by late 1945. Cities existed as rubble fields. Fuel for heating was scarce enough that people died of cold in winter. Children fainted in schools from hunger. Yet here in America, prisoners rode through towns where bakeries threw away unsold loaves at closing time, where children bought ice cream with pocket change, where families lit barbecues in their yards on weekends, as if abundance were a birthright rather than a miracle. The effect was profoundly disorienting. We saw no poverty anywhere. A Bavarian prisoner admitted years later, no hunger, no despair, no fear. What we saw was a land living as if the war didn't exist at all. That's when I realized everything we had been told was constructed from lies. Suspicion lingered for some. Whispers circulated that perhaps the Americans were staging all this abundance specifically for prisoner eyes, that beyond the routes they traveled might lie hidden poverty and suffering. But each trip outside the wire, whether to farms or factories or construction sites, confirmed the same reality. Markets full of goods, factories running at capacity, towns intact and prosperous, families living without the constant fear that shaped life in Germany. Even the ambient smells of American towns, gasoline and grilled meat and fresh bread testified to a way of life that couldn't be faked on such a comprehensive scale. The shock of those excursions exceeded any feast behind barbed wire. Inside camp boundaries, one might maintain skepticism, might convince oneself that appearances deceived. On American streets surrounded by ordinary life, denial became impossible. The abundance wasn't theater, it was genuine, pervasive, and apparently inexhaustible. As the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion and Germany itself lay in ruins, prisoners knew their time in America couldn't last. Soon they would board ships again, crossing back toward a homeland shattered beyond recognition, toward families who could scarcely imagine what their captured sons and brothers had witnessed. Late 1945 brought the great reversal into motion. Trains carried prisoners to ports once again, not arriving fresh from combat, but departing with knowledge they couldn't unlearn. Liberty ships ferried them back across the Atlantic, and this time no mystery surrounded what awaited on the other side. Germany wasn't the prosperous nation propaganda had promised, wasn't the superior civilization that justified all sacrifice. It was a wasteland of bombed cities, collapsed factories, and ration cards that promised more than they could deliver. The contrast between departure and arrival broke hearts and spirits. In America, a prisoner might have started his day with 3 eggs, coffee, and a glass of milk. In Hamburg or Cologne, his family counted themselves fortunate to share a single egg among 4 people. In camp, he bought chocolate bars and cola with his canteen credits. At home, his children waited in lines for turnips and watery soup. One man described stepping onto German soil as falling from heaven directly into hell, and the metaphor wasn't exaggeration. Statistics documented the despair that awaited. By 1946, average daily rations in occupied Germany had fallen below 1,000 calories, sometimes dropping to 800 in the British-controlled zone. Malnutrition became epidemic, especially among children and the elderly. Black markets thrived as the only reliable source of adequate food, requiring money or goods that most people didn't possess. For men returning from a land where prisoners ate steaks and pies, the shock of reunion was almost unbearable. A former POW who had been held in Nebraska wrote in his diary about his wife looking older than her years, his children visibly thin, and being unable to explain that in prison he had eaten better than they did in freedom. Yet amid the guilt and gnawing hunger, something else persisted in their memories. They had lived inside a democracy that treated enemies with decency, that allowed prisoners to earn wages, to read books freely, to play sports, to taste barbecue on national holidays. They had seen supermarkets that overflowed, farms that produced without apparent limits, civilians living without fear of bombers overhead or starvation tomorrow. The paradox reached its final form in their minds. They had entered as conquerors, believing themselves masters of a weak, decadent nation. They left humbled and convinced that America's greatest weapon had never been its tanks or aircraft, but its abundance, its casual ease, its ordinary prosperity that didn't require propaganda to seem impressive. One veteran interviewed decades later summed it up plainly. "We were defeated twice," he said, "first by their armies and then by their way of life. The armies broke our forces in the field. The way of life broke our certainty that we had been fighting for something superior. Some prisoners carried lessons from captivity into the work of rebuilding Germany. Former POWs returned with altered perspectives on democracy, on fairness, on the possibilities that peace could offer. Historians have noted how the POW experience functioned as a quiet but genuine influence in post-war reconciliation between former enemies. They had seen a future, one scholar observed, because in America, even as captives, they had lived inside it for a while. The story of German prisoners in the United States isn't one of cruelty or systematic deprivation, the usual expectations of war captivity. Instead, it's a story of paradox layered upon contradiction. Enemy soldiers anticipated chains but found cola. They anticipated scraps but found feasts. They anticipated propaganda but found daily truth written in calorie counts, wage slips, and markets that never seemed to empty. When the barbed wire eventually rusted away and the camps emptied and the men returned to rubble and reconstruction, the memory persisted. With it came a lesson that echoed forward through generations. American power rested not only in industrial might and military force, but in the ability to demonstrate to enemies a different kind of strength entirely. The power of plenty, the power of freedom lived rather than merely claimed, the power of ordinary life conducted without fear or shortage. In the end, the greatest weapon wasn't bombs dropping from the sky, but abundance served on a plate, offered even to those who had come as enemies and stayed as witnesses to a different way of being human.